What is a story quilt? Story quilts, well, kind of every quilt is a story quilt, right? It has some sort of story behind it, which I find fascinating, whether it was made by a loved one for someone or it was made to signify an occasion like a wedding or a baptism or a birth, or maybe it actually does tell the story of an event in a more narrative, direct fashion, but everything down to how the stitches were made, whose hands pieced it together, the fabrics chosen, all of that has a story behind it. And I find these quilted textile documents to be so powerful and healing, really, for me as a tool for my own personal healing and expression. So this was my first real story quilt called Wings, my Wings quilt. And I made this to actually work through this feeling of frustration that I was having in my life at the time, where I felt like I was surrounded by all these obstacles that I represented as X's. And as I was sewing this, I realized the X's were actually my way through. The X's were not obstacles, but actually where X marks the spot. X was the answer. So that's my Wings quilt. And this one is a more recent quilt that I made for the story of this land that we call Springbird, where we live. Each panel is a different part of the story. So this one reads more like a comic book, except for it is read in a spiral that ends at the center where the snake is. So this one I worked on bit by panel with applique, rough edge applique, and embroidery, which are my go-tos for making these story quilts, and which I will be teaching you in the workshop. So we'll be using lots of bits of fabric. Please bring your own if you have anything special that relates to your story, and embroidery floss and other big threads that will be shown. So we want our stitches to be seen. And this is my current quilt, wolf quilt. You can see we'll be using an embroidery hoop. So join me for a day of working on your story quilt. You can either start a big piece or make a small piece that would be finished into something like a pillow. You can choose the narrative, comic book, or like paneled way of telling your story, or you might want to do the big mural version of your, like my wolf quilt and my Wings quilt. Or you might want to choose your own thing and create a new way of doing a story quilt. So all of that is fine, but just come prepared with a story in mind. And if you have any textiles are particularly connected to your project and to your story, please bring those. But everything else will be provided for an amazing day of being together in community, in nature, sewing our stories and healing our souls. So the Story Quilt Workshop is November 7th and 9th, 10 to 3 at Springbird Cottage. More information at springbird.land.